And welcome back to Turning Point here at KPFZ 88.1 Lake County Community Radio, serving all of Lake County, California, and beyond on the World Wide Web out there. And I'm Ron, you got Ray here.
Yeah, hi there.
And we've got Jim, our communications engineer, working on the board. And today we have a special guest that hopefully is on the phone. And our guest today is Mendocino County Sheriff Tom Allman. And Sheriff Allman, are you there?
I am here, and good morning from Mendocino County.
Hey, excellent. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm a native of Mendocino County. Good to hear your voice.
Well, I could barely hear you, but yes, good morning to you also.
Can you? Okay, let's try to make sure you can hear it. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you fine.
And now, can you hear me?
I cannot.
Okay, he's working on it.
There we are. There we are. Much
Oh,
better.
good. We're good now.
There you go. That's Ray, and I'm Ron.
Yes.
Ron, good morning.
Good morning. Well, hey, Sheriff, we had you on because I think it was about a month ago. I was listening to one of our sister stations in Mendocino, where you were doing a show, and
Right.
in passing, nothing was expanded more on it, but in passing, the statement was made that there is possibly currently genetically engineered cannabis being grown in Mendocino County in spite of a ban on GMOs. And that's really one of the main reasons we wanted to have you on today, to help us explore, whatever knowledge you have about this. I'm personally not thrilled about the whole thing. So what can you tell us, Sheriff?
Yes.
Well, Ron and Ray, good morning, and Jim, thanks for doing the job you're doing in there. Mendocino County was on the forefront many years ago of GMO prohibition. Measure H was passed by the voters, and it certainly, you can look at our nation now and you can see places throughout our nation, counties and cities, which have adopted a similar type of statement. But I think that what I'd like to discuss, and we'll certainly talk about GMO, marijuana, but the growing techniques of marijuana have drastically changed, say, in the last 20 years. But the last 3 years, they've changed to the point that should be an awakening to anybody who believes that marijuana is just grown by people putting seeds in the ground and it's a harmless herb that grows and that law enforcement is always going to say no to. And I think that you're going to see in the next upcoming years, you'll see a culture of acceptance by society and by law enforcement. But I hope that nobody is going to put the stamp of approval on some of these aggressive growing techniques, abusive growing techniques, and techniques that are endangering our environment in ways that we've never even considered. For me, the most drastic example is last year, south of Ukiah, our deputies eradicated a garden. I believe there were about 200 plants, and they were monster plants. I mean, these plants were of the type that were going to produce 10 to 12 pounds of processed marijuana per plant. And while they were there, they went into the house and saw petri dishes, saw white gloves and white jackets and goggles, and it was an absolute GMO-type operation that we don't have a lot of experts in this area who are going to come in and say, well, this is exactly what you have. We certainly took evidence, we took photographs, but we ended up having to call our hazardous materials disposal team to the site for them to suit up and take care of the chemicals and the science experiments which were happening. And this is not an isolated incident. The deputies have told me that they've seen this before. So when I talk about, the growing techniques have changed in the last 3 years or so, there are people who in our county who believe that marijuana cultivation is just as harmless to the earth as growing a tomato plant or a corn plant. And I'm telling you that you need to look at what's happening right now. When Proposition 215 was passed in 1996 by the voters, at least in Mendocino County, a marijuana plant would produce maybe upwards of a pound and it would be in the area of 10 to 12% THC, as opposed to in the late 70s when marijuana was starting to really become a visible front page news item. It was in the area of 5% THC.
Right.
Yeah.
Last month, Colorado authorities reported that they have marijuana which has been so genetically modified that it's in the area of 37.6% THC.
Wow.
And their commercial, this is not your your grandfather's Cadillac, and I'm telling you, this is not your grandfather's marijuana.
No.
With that type of THC, now think of it, if it's 37.6% THC, you're talking 6 times, 7 times the potency of what it was in the 70s. And if people are not willing to even acknowledge the fact that this has severe damage on young minds and young bodies that are developing, then I would love for them to tell me the reason why they believe it won't affect them. Because when a person up to the age of 22, and we all know this, when they're developing and their organs are developing and their brain's developing and their bones are developing, when you start throwing chemicals in the body, such as a 37.6% THC content, you're really and truly messing with the future of the body there. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to pretend to be a doctor or a counselor or therapist. I'm a law enforcement officer who's been doing this since 1982. And recently there was a New Zealand study, and I would encourage people to look up this on the internet, a 20-year study. This was a 20-year study by the government of New Zealand to talk about how the potency of marijuana is affecting young people. And it's drastic. I'll tell you the last chapter. Spoiler alert. I'm telling you that the New Zealand study has said the difference between kids who smoke marijuana and not smoke marijuana on a regular basis is an 8-point difference in IQ, and that's 12%, really and truly, of what an average person's IQ is. So when we talk about these genetically modified growing techniques, we talk about we have people now who are burning CO2. Ron, do you understand what that means?
Somewhat. I'm not. Yeah.
Could you give us a little?
That was not a trick question to find out if you're doing it. I promise. Okay. Ray got it.
Well, I'm not. but go ahead. Explain it if you would.
So we all remember our 4th grade science classes where I hope we do, where we're talking about CO2 and the plants breathe in CO2 and they breathe out oxygen in a very elementary explanation. That's what happens. But with indoor grows, when people are producing so much marijuana indoors, they're basically running out of CO2. The plants are producing oxygen, and the plants need CO2, and that's why you have people who have CO2 generators that are inside of a house to produce more CO2
Gotcha. Yeah.
instead of oxygen, and it is in upwards of 20% plant growth when they do this. And so I know the phrase carbon footprint is bantered around, and global warming, and people are saying it's not happening. It's true or it's not true. There's all these disagreements, but no one's going to disagree that this is not a good growing technique. This is a technique only used by people who want to get rich quick. No. They could care less about Lake County, Mendocino County, Humboldt County, Trinity County. They just want to make their money, and they're using these techniques to grow the most marijuana they can at the highest THC they can, so they can get the most money they can. And I remember Proposition 215, and those were not talking points that were used on either side. California still has Proposition 215. We do not have recreational marijuana yet. It's certainly going to be on the ballot next year, and the voters can decide. But right now, the principles of Proposition 215 are still in place. There's been some changes by the state assembly and the governor and by courts, but for the most part, not for the most part, let me clearly say, commercial marijuana cultivation in California is still a felony. It is still a felony to commercially cultivate marijuana.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So when people are growing their 6 plants, 8 plants, 12 plants, I think that law enforcement has got to the point at least in this part of the state, where really and truly we wouldn't walk across the street to see something like that. You know, we have other things we need to deal with, and I long for the days that we can spend more time on methamphetamine and domestic violence than we can on marijuana. However, when we start getting these abusive growers and the people who really and truly don't give a darn about who we really are, then law enforcement is the only option of going after these people and saying, you can't do this in our county. And if you want to go back home to wherever you live, Kansas City, Miami Beach, I don't care where it is, if you want to go back home and you do it, then do it. But what I believe is happening is that we have a small percentage of growers who, and they are the minority in our counties, who are taking advantage of the good-natured vote that happened in 1996 and said, we're here to make our $1 million in a hurry, and then we're going to take our money and go elsewhere. So that's where law enforcement is focusing our attention. I'd love to talk about some other growing techniques that are hideous to our environment, but I certainly want to hear what your questions are also.
Well, Sheriff, almost everything you've said I can agree with. And for me, I feel the same way. The way you're talking about the way they're growing cannabis, I feel the same way about cannabis and every other crop that we consume, through the grocery stores or whatever.
Right.
They're all using bad practices, and the sane way to go, in my opinion, is organic, whether you're growing carrots or cannabis, etc. And what's really, sort of mind-boggling, just to switch back over to the GMOs, to me is, how you mentioned Colorado. Well, we're sure that genetically engineered cannabis is being sold legally in Colorado.
Yes.
And, in a situation where GMO crops are supposed to be, approved by the FDA, right? And this camel is getting its nose under the tent every which way from Sunday, including in a place like Mendocino where there's bans on genetically engineered crops.
Yes.
Well, let me go. If that scares you, Ron, let me scare you even more.
Tell us more.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
So let's talk about this. Because we still have a federal ban on marijuana, but we have Colorado, which is for California. This is great for us because for once we are not the point of the spear that's going into uncharted territory. Okay, we get to see what's happening in Colorado, and let's use medical marijuana in Colorado, for example. They're pushing the edibles. They're pushing a lot of things that we haven't really seen on the forefront here in California. But with the federal authorities not recognizing marijuana, that means the FDA is not coming in and looking at anything
Exactly.
that some people are saying is medical. And so when you start getting the 90% THC cookies, and I'm not exaggerating with there because with concentrated cannabis, you can get 90%
You could do that,
THC.
yes. Mm-hmm.
And the instructions on these in cookies will say, and I don't know you too personal, but I don't know how much willpower you have, but the instructions on these cookies say, take one bite of the cookie, wait 2 hours, and if you still are feeling an effect, have another bite of a cookie.
Well, I don't think you'd want to leave me alone with a brownie like that.
Well, you have a brownie
it's hard
and
to
a cold
do.
glass of milk. You're going to finish the brownie.
You are, absolutely.
So now, one of the things Colorado has done to rectify this as of February 1st is the medical portion of edibles are now, they cannot go higher than 10 milligrams of THC per single item, and they're in individually packaged wrappers or containers, so they're child-proof. However, because Colorado has medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, there's nothing to prohibit people from still making those 90% THC cookies, but calling them recreational as opposed to just 10 milligrams of THC cookies and calling it medical. So there's rules that they have to be in separate stores, but there's a fallacy when people are assuming that there's no difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, when there's a huge difference. And Colorado is learning that. Colorado's learning that the money that was assumed would come in with taxes, it's not coming in because people are maintaining their medical recommendation cards, and you don't have to pay taxes on medical marijuana where you pay 25% taxes on recreational marijuana. So I hope that the voters next year will at least look at some of the problems that these other states are having and say, well, we don't want these problems. And we can manage our marijuana situation without, going big. This is going to be a commercial marijuana statewide operation. Not recreational marijuana. I'm calling it just absolutely commercial marijuana, where you're having cartoons such as a Joe Camel figure. I saw him in Denver when I was there in January going to a conference. I saw cartoon figures on public transportation promising free joints if you came into their marijuana shop, or promising a free lift ticket for a ski resort if you bought 2 ounces of their recreational marijuana. And I just don't, I'm not the most conservative guy in the world, but I'm also not a person who says I think we should go all the way in on this one. We really need to learn from other lessons and say, let's go in as smart before we go to a point of no return on marijuana.
Sheriff Allman, you mentioned more or less the folks that have been coming in are coming from other areas. At least you alluded to that. They're more or less carpetbaggers. They're here to make the money and then go. Are there other things that they are doing that alarm you environmentally or socially that you would like to talk about?
That's a fair question, Ray. Thank you. Let me start by saying, and don't read into this because it's going to stand alone.
Okay.
Old hippies are not our problem.
We're glad to hear that.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. I'll take the handcuffs off now.
Okay. People who appreciate who we are and where we are and what our counties are, those are people who are not, in 20 years from now, going to be cursed upon. Okay? Right. But the people, let me just say this. I asked our marijuana sergeant yesterday about butane honey oil labs. And he said right now, and this isn't a scientific study, this is his thought here, 75% of our indoor grows right now in Mendocino County have butane honey oil labs at their growing location. So it's a business decision to say, I'm no longer going to compost my seeds or my stems and my leaves. I'm going to turn what used to be compost into this honey oil. And let me explain what honey oil is, because it's not associated with honey. It's associated with butane. That's the most important thing that you can understand here. That what honey oil is a manner in which a marijuana grower can extract the THC in a concentrated form from any part of the plant. And yes, I've seen it, stalks being used, so forth. It's not as hardy in stalks, but certainly in the leaves and so forth. And so what they do is they take what used to be compost and they shove it in this specially formulated PVC pipe, and then they buy cases and cases of butane, compressed butane, and they put the butane on a nipple on one end of the pipe, and they insert the butane into it, and so at the other end, the butane forces the extract to come out, to drip out, and hence honey oil. Well, you know what? These are not rocket scientists. So your listeners out there who say, well, this sounds like a good idea, let me tell you what happens. Butane is heavier than air, and I hope you learned that in school. And what happens is, in an enclosed space, butane starts building up at the bottom, at the floor, and comes up to a certain level until it reaches an ignition source, such as an electrical plug, a light switch, your cell phone, something that's going to put some kind of spark in there. And then for about a 32nd of a second, the entire room's going to be 1,500 degrees, and you're going to have flesh dripping off your fingers. And I'm not saying this to scare anybody. I'm telling you the facts. I have been to fire scenes where I have seen flesh dripping from people's bones from 3 feet down, and the rest of their bodies have not been impacted. And there's other parts of your bodies you don't want burnt from 3 feet down, but these people basically explode the house that they're renting. They rarely do it in their own house. They do it in motels or houses they're renting, or somebody else's house, somebody else's garage, and they completely destroy the building. And they've done this because they've seen on the internet that it's fun to make butane honey oil. And one of our local fire departments here in Mendocino County told me late last year that 80% of all structure fires that their department is now going on are associated with indoor marijuana operations, whether it's butane honey oil or some guy who has no idea about electricity and tries to wire a whole bunch of electrical cords in his house so he can have increased grow lights and fans and so forth. And so we have these people who are doing absolute infrastructure damage to our counties just for the sake of extracting money from people. And second, the next thing I'm going to go to, I wish we could have a conversation about bringing more tourism into our counties or bringing more legal economy into our counties. But these are not the facts right now. The facts are we're facing an epidemic of that Colorado is already experiencing. In Colorado, because a lot of their indoor grows, or a lot of their marijuana grows, are indoor operations, people use hydroponics, and the principle of hydroponics is you recirculate the water over and over so you can reuse the chemicals and the fertilizer and any type of growth hormones that you have. So they get a full cycle of marijuana, and then at the end of that cycle, it's not uncommon for them to flush their entire cycle of water out so they can start their new cycle, and they're getting 3-month cycles of marijuana. And so the municipal sewer treatment systems are being impacted in ways they never had intended. These are unintended consequences. The sewer treatment plants are saying they're getting hundreds of thousands of gallons of this water per day coming into their sewer treatment plants that they do not know how to neutralize. The whole principle of sewer treatment operations is to neutralize the water coming through, and then it can be dispersed, whether you're going to spray it onto a field or let it go directly into a flowing water source. But they're being trapped by not being able to disperse this water because it has so many chemicals in it. And I can't think of too many people who are going to say, well, this is the right way to do it. We need to do it like this. In Mendocino and Lake County, I hope that we would never get to that point, but it's happening in Colorado, and it could happen in other parts of California if we get to the point of allowing a lot of indoor marijuana operations to go. We know what's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with you there, Sheriff. And like here in Lake County, in the unincorporated areas, they have basically outlawed outdoor plants, even one. And so it's forced a lot of these growers to go indoors, whether they're after money or not.
They're indoors.
They're indoors. And
doing many of the things you just mentioned.
Yeah. And what really kills me, Sheriff, is that, and I was one of the people back in the day that was fighting for laws that made more sense, right? And then we passed 215, and people like me were trying to. The reason 215 was worded the way it was basically so that folks that weren't involved in commerce could get what they needed.
Right.
And and instead, what happened real soon after 215 is this. A lot of the people I worked with, I'm sorry to say, were after the money. Okay, and they went in and made deals with the state legislature and got SB 420 passed. And that's really the legislation that opened the door to a lot of the madness that's going on now because of the reasonable compensation stuff and the different ordinances that can be passed county by county instead of one uniform 215 for the whole state. But we could go, into that. But what I really just want to get back to is the gorilla in the room that you keep referencing, and that is money. And as long as we don't have a line between commerce and what a person is growing for their own use, for their own needs, because right now that line is all blurred, and it kind of creates a fertile field,
literally,
for all this money motivated activity that you're alluding to, that I think is not only bad for the environment, bad for individuals, but it's bad at the end of the day because it ends up robbing us of resources that for example, here in Lake County, we've got one of the highest unemployment rates in the state.
Okay.
And well, if you just took this example, wherever there's vineyards growing, if you were growing industrial cannabis, for example, which would have to be processed locally because it's not economical to ship that anywhere. We could all have jobs making blue jeans, tennis shoes, paper, any kind of products that you can make with petroleum or timber. You can make with cannabis, and it just seems to me that because the government is in the business, and I know you and I probably differ on this point, but because the government is in the business of regulating natural plants in the way that they are, it has, really brought this all about. It has made the plant to the value of where people are willing to risk their lives and their freedoms and
their neighbors'
and
homes
kill people
and,
and you name it to get on this gold rush.
Well, Ron, let me tell you how big of a financial cost this is, and what I'm going to tell you isn't a far out example. I think this, while it isn't the absolute standard, it's a common standard. And last year in Mendocino County, we had a very big fire up north in Laytonville,
right?
And we had huge amounts of firefighters coming in. And this firefighter came to me, and he told me that he had talked to a local marijuana grower that was near a fire that was really obviously very concerned about protecting his venture there to make sure that he didn't lose money. And the marijuana grower told him that for the last 3 months of the last 3 weeks of the marijuana season, he was spending $50 per plant per day to make sure that he was going to get the 12.5 pounds per plant that his business plan said he needed.
Wow.
Well, I can't even imagine spending $50 per plant per day of what kind of chemicals and who knows what kind of derivatives you're putting into the soil. And these are not the organic things that we talked about earlier. And
right.
The
No.
vast majority of Lake and Mendocino County residents that live outside of incorporated cities, including myself, we have wells at our house,
Right.
and we count on our well of delivering safe water to our family.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to decide or to make the decision that what goes in the ground eventually ends up in a well. And that's why there's been such a push for us to make sure people don't flush their prescription drugs and to do this stuff. But we're losing focus by asking people to quit buying and quit using unsafe materials that they use just for steroid growing techniques. And that's what you heard me say on KZYX last month when we're talking about these steroid-driven ventures and people getting the 12.5 pounds per plant. That's not a natural way to grow marijuana. It's just
and you know what, Sheriff, I have to bring it also back to the culture and the system has allowed for sort of, let's say, somewhat double standards. So in other words, it's legal in Mendocino, and anybody can go buy Roundup at the store and pour it all over their, even if they're on a creek side. I mean, I'm here in Lake County.
We're watching them spray it.
Yeah, they're rounding up the whole side of hillsides that go right into to tributary creeks for the lake, etc. And all I'm saying is that if we start implementing standards across the board so that everybody is affected, not just cannabis growers, right? Whether you're growing carrots or whatever, it's time to be responsible gardeners or, producers of whatever it is they're producing.
And then that would have to be enforced.
Right. So
equally.
Like when we're sitting here just talking about the bad practices of financially motivated cannabis growers. I think that we're missing the bigger target. Whereas if we spread this out and basically let the cannabis growers and everybody else know, this isn't about one demo. This is about everybody.
Right.
This is about keeping our water clean, our environment safe, et cetera, et cetera. I think we really need to go that direction. And instead, you've got, sort of this atmosphere of, well, there's a double standard. I mean, these guys are sitting there thinking, well, hell, if Monsanto and the rest of them can make millions of dollars with all their chemicals, why can't we?
Why can't we? Exactly.
And we will agree on probably 95% of this stuff, but I want to talk about growing techniques that other places would never use. I think we would be hard-pressed to find a wine grower who's going to buy rat poison by the pallet. I think that it would be hard-pressed to find a grape grower who's getting the pink powder that comes from Mexico that you pour outside of a marijuana garden, and so if anything passes up it, it's going to eat out their intestines, and they're going to die a horrible death when they get water. So while I certainly can agree that a standard growing technique and growing methods should be recognized by all, I think there's some very abusive ones that we mainly see coming from marijuana gardens that are affecting our environment. Because one of the things that grape growers do, and I you certainly have your grapes in Lake, we have it here, is every year they use the same ranch, the same soil, and they're putting cover crops in the winter to put the nitrogen back in the soil. They understand, just like a timber harvester, you don't want to ruin it because next year you're going to depend on that for your income. But we have marijuana growers who don't care about what happens to the land because they're going to be somewhere in South America enjoying their, cash, and they're basically pooping in our backyard and then leaving the next day.
Well, now we get back to the money motivation because as long as that plant is made so falsely valuable, I think we're going to have these problems that you're talking about.
But we're not an island, Ron. California is not an island. So as soon as we say, well, let's have recreational marijuana and it's going to drop the value down to $400 a plant, I'm going to say, well, wait a minute. What happens to the guy who shows up from New York who's going to buy it all and take it back to New York and sell it for $6,000 a pound because he's going to break it up in ounces? And if our democracy is going to try to grab a hold of this, and I would encourage us to talk about this at the federal level and come to a conclusion. I'm not saying what the conclusion is because it's much more complicated than just a simple rural sheriff can come up with. There's economic factors and social factors that all are going to have repercussions by whatever we decide here in California, and that's why I'm hoping that the voters won't just arbitrarily say, well, recreational marijuana is going to allow our law enforcement officers to focus on other things. Because I'm going to tell you, recreational marijuana is not going to take the crime out of marijuana.
Absolutely.
We're still going to have home invasions. Yeah. We're still going to have kids. And let me talk about this. In Denver and Vail, in the school districts, because marijuana has been socially accepted by the parents and by the voters, some of the school districts are reporting expulsions up 3 times because kids are bringing marijuana to school. So in other words, mom and dad are smoking a joint at home, they're not locking it up, and little Junior takes it to high school the next day and gets expelled from school. And if we're going to demand people lock up their guns and request they lock up prescriptions, I'm saying we're going to demand that people lock up their marijuana too, because there's a time that we as society need to take a stand and say, all right, we do have these freedoms, but let's not let the freedoms get out of control.
Well, and I agree, and let's look at Colorado even further. And I know people there, locals that that are, the black market is just as strong as it ever was in Colorado because you can get cheaper cannabis on the streets than you can in the places where they sell it, and for the most part, it's the tourists and whatnot that come and shop at those places. So it hasn't done anything really to hurt the black market in that sense. And I want to throw this at you, Sheriff, because it's not it's more, I guess, from my belief, from my understanding of life and whatever,
we're going to get very deep here.
Yeah, we're going to get very deep here for just a second.
Okay.
From my understanding, the Constitution, generally, the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution are meant to protect rights that you are naturally endowed with. So in other words, for the first time on planet Earth, it was in writing that you didn't get your human rights from the king or from some other place. You were actually born with them, and then this document was supposed to protect those rights. And
unless you make some mistakes in life, and then those rights are taken away from you.
Right.
There it is.
And so my question is, because I've done, federal, case on this. I've done state. I've been working on this issue a long, long time. And, what is it that, regardless of whether carrots are legal or not, setting that aside, right? Do you feel that human beings have some sort of natural right to grow a carrot or a tomato plant?
Well, I without taking it out of context, of course we do. But then, what do they do with that carrot? Do they carve the carrot into the shape of a gun?
Absolutely.
And
that's what I was
hijack
getting
an airplane?
to. That's what I'm getting to, Sheriff.
You went there
exactly
for us.
right.
Thank you.
See, because what I feel like is that the problem starts when we think we can, let's say, snuff out a basic fundamental human right and start telling people what plants they can grow and can't grow instead of regulating at the point of use. So in other words, let's say you're going to grow a coca plant and you think you're going to manufacture cocaine. Well, the manufacturing of the cocaine part, I would think, is where the government, especially if
that's where it crosses over
right,
into
especially
something.
if it's in commerce, jurisdiction. But the growing of the plant itself, I think, is where we have really gone off the sanity track here, because when we outlaw and when the government, and I know we may disagree on this, but it's just a point I feel like I need to make, is that when we outlaw natural plants, that automatically creates this scene.
Oh, Ron, you and I may disagree on this. With your analogy, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, but radiation comes from the earth naturally, and I don't think we should encourage people to go suck down radiation and doing whatever, because it's going to have an effect on our insurance, our medical costs, our state costs, because people are going to say, "Oh, now I have cancer and I'm dying," and the government's going to have to pay for my medical. So there's not a fine line. There's some very clear principles that we should look at it, and California has always been on the leading edge of coming up to where these, what conversations we're going to have, whether it's, what's happening in Washington, D.C. today with the Supreme Court of hearing arguments for same-sex marriage. I mean, California has always been on the leading edge of this. And so it's not an easy answer. So actually, Ron, you and I are probably going to agree on a lot more than we disagree on. But one of the things that I will say here, and I hope you agree on, whatever solution we come with, is going to have to be a societal answer. Government isn't going to come up with the answer.
Agreed.
And I don't think that an ad hoc committee of citizens is going to come up with an answer. We have to come up with an answer and let the society say, all right, this is an answer that we can live with, because I'm really tired of home invasions. I'm tired of people getting so greedy over marijuana, they think they have to bust into someone's house and tie them up and steal everything, even though that person wasn't even growing marijuana. So, we've got a little bit off topic of what we first started about the environmental things and the GMOs that are happening, but marijuana impacts every segment of our society. Our youth, our economy, our environment, our medical. Marijuana has an effect. And one of the things that I have long said, the more we talk about it, like we're doing right now, we're getting closer to a solution. Because
absolutely,
here's my unscientific, unproven survey. You ready for this, right?
Well, I'm ready for it.
5% of the population think you should be able to do anything you want with marijuana. Smoke it, eat it, put it in every orifice of your body, if that's what they want, okay? The other 5% of the population thinks that we should go back to the 40s, where you should go to federal prison for having a marijuana seed. And I've come to realize that when I meet with these two extreme segments of our population. The only thing they want to do is yell and try to get me to change my mind. But that 90% in the middle, those are the magical people. Those are the ones who can come up with the right solution, even though these two other extremes are yelling at us and saying, do it my way or don't do it my way. You're evil if you don't do it my way. So I don't go to meetings now where there's those 5% of the segments on either side, because it doesn't do them any good, certainly doesn't do me any good.
Exactly.
And we all walk away needing Rolaids and Tums, okay?
Yeah.
But that 90% in the middle, those are the people that I say, yeah, let's have a discussion. I want to hear your views. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to hear how this has impacted your life. And all I ask that you do is, in return, listen to my views, my thoughts, and how this has impacted my life. Because my wife and I have raised kids. Mm-hmm. We know how marijuana affects kids in schools, and when I'm driving when I ran for sheriff, I was driving a 20-year-old truck. And my son asked me, why am I driving a 20-year-old truck when, Johnny's dad is driving a brand new Dodge pickup? And that was a dinner time conversation for me to say, well, son, your mom and I have made a decision that we're not going to grow marijuana, whereas other people may have made a decision to grow marijuana so they can have a new Dodge truck every year.
Right.
Yes.
So let's continue to have these conversations and not yell at anybody and tell them they're wrong, but let's just say, let's listen to each other and come up with a rational conclusion at the end of the day. And then, as I said at the beginning of this interview, we as society, and specifically law enforcement, we can focus on the bigger elephants in the room, the methamphetamines and domestic violence and the environmental crimes that are happening in other areas of our society.
And what's so also, and I agree, Sheriff, and what's also I feel so desperately important is that we try to get a hold of real facts and science, because
Stop it.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy.
He's
but,
wild. Yeah.
From the time that these laws started coming into effect, like in 1911 is when Massachusetts passed their first cannabis law. California was in 1913, and then you go up this scale, and then you get to 37 with the Marijuana Tax Act. But in all those cases, there was no good science, no good facts. It was all,
scare techniques.
Yeah, yeah. And so in some sense, I hope and pray that while we have this conversation, that science, facts come out and help guide the policies.
Okay, but remember, some of those facts you may not like.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, that's why you listen.
Right.
That's how you learn things.
Yeah.
Now, thinking of that, this whole thing with Pinoleville and their plan for cultivation.
And I know the sheriff's got to go here pretty soon, so
Yeah.
we'll try to make it
This
quick.
is worth 5 minutes, and then I can run out the door, okay?
That sounds good.
Okay.
What's going on there,
Okay.
and where do you see that it's illegal?
Well, I see it illegal because, without boring you and your listeners, California is what's referred to as a public law 280 state. And
Familiar with that. Most of us are.
And please, if you're out there listening and you say, what the heck's he talking about?
Ask
Google
us
public
later.
law 280. In the early 50s, our Congress designated, at one time 8, but I think it's down to 7 states to be public law 280 states where the sheriff is responsible, not just because he wants to be, but because he has to be.
Right.
Well, for all state laws on Indian country, and that's how it's defined, Indian country.
Right.
And so Mendocino County, we have 11 Indian reservations or rancherias composed of 7 tribes, and there are areas that our law enforcement officers are the main law enforcement in that area. And Pinoleville is an area that's it's both what we call fee land and non-fee land. They pay taxes on some, and some is in federal trust.
Yeah, it's kind of checkerboarded. Yeah.
Very checkerboarded. And so there was a news report that the Pinoleville tribe was going to have a very large-scale commercial marijuana operation.
Yes.
I had an opportunity to meet with a couple of them several months ago, and I merely asked them if they could show me how they thought that this was going to be legal. I have not got anything in return from them. I'm not aware of construction starting out there. I was told initially, at least I was told, a newspaper article said that they were going to start construction in February, and I don't believe they started construction yet. I know that I've spoken with our U.S. attorney in this area, Melinda Haig, who has assured me the federal government has not put their stamp of approval on it, and I've spoken with Kamala Harris, our state attorney general, and she's also told me that the state has not put any kind of approval on this one. So I think that what we're waiting for are for some legal reasons of how they can proceed with this. I hope it doesn't come to the fact that they're going to be defiant. I don't think they are. I've met with them. They're polite people. Pinoleville has a very strong reputation of working good in our community, of being very strong environmental advocates.
Mm-hmm.
And so...
And the investors are from out of county, are they
They're
not?
just out of county.
Colorado.
Colorado, Kansas City, and to scare you really worse, Las Vegas.
Ah.
Okay? So, I think we could all determine, at least come to our own conclusion of why out-of-state investors would get involved in this. They're trying to push the envelope and saying, can they make $1 million real quickly? And I don't want to sell out our counties that easy. And if we're going to do that, let's find out if it's legal.
Right.
Let's find out the best way it can happen to where the quality of life and public safety is not compromised. That's very important. I mean, that's a basic reason why you have a sheriff's office and police department. To make sure the quality of life and public safety is not compromised. And your sheriff, Brian Martin, and I are good friends. We talk about this on a weekly or biweekly basis of many issues to make sure that we are in tandem with each other, and I really like Brian. I'm glad he's over there, and he seems to be doing a good job. But on Pinoleville, I wish them well. However, I don't want to wish them in a situation where, whether legally or financially, they're going to say this was a bad decision.
Right.
And
thank you.
Yeah, and I would ask this though, because we've got, let's say foreign investors. And because there is a GMO ban in Mendocino, if they were going to grow corn or whatever, people would definitely want to make sure it wasn't GMO corn. So I just hope that in some sense somebody's ringing the GMO bell and asking these folks to, be conscious that whatever they're growing, if they get that far, isn't genetically engineered.
That they have a responsibility not only to follow the local laws, but their conscience.
Maybe next year, whatever's going to be on the ballot, Ron, we need to try to get something like that in the wording. So it's not generally accepted that, let's say a brand new growing technique was derived in a different country, and brought in here. Well, wait a minute. This is Lake County. This is Mendocino County. This is our county. We don't want our county to be permanently damaged by somebody else's abusive growing technique.
No, and then leave us with a disaster, a Superfund to clean up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Hey, well, Ron and Ray, you and Jim, you all sound like great people. I don't know you, but you sound like good people that you're just trying to get the truth, just trying to find out information. And thanks for doing what you're doing, because your public radio and obviously what's happening in Nepal is on the minds of a lot of people. Yeah. And I'm involved in trying to get some relief over to Nepal as quick as possible.
Marvelous.
If we had something like that happen in Lake and Mendocino, and knocking on wood that we never would, I'm going to say it's public radio that's going to allow us as a community and a county and just every citizen out there to communicate and to get to a solution. So
absolutely.
Thanks for doing public radio. I know you're not in it for the money. No. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to say the same to you, Sheriff.
Yeah,
I've heard you on public radio since you've been elected, and by going on and speaking and making yourself available on public radio in Mendocino and here, I think you're doing a great service, and I really appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you. We're all having fun. How about that?
All right.
That's important.
Have a great day.
Hey, stay safe. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sheriff Allman. All right. So that was very informative.
There it is there.
Yeah.
If anybody thought that the GMO issue was separate from the cannabis issue, like we heard during the last election here in this county, that's from the front line, folks. They're finding cannabis grows in Mendocino that are basically GMO labs.
And I'm sure they're finding the same in Lake County.
Yeah, and they're doing it legally in Colorado, under Colorado law. And I guess we do have a caller.
We can take a caller, can we? Yeah.
Caller, are you
Quick
there?
Quick and brief.
Go for it.
What a great, informative show. I loved it. Every minute of it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your show, you guys.
Hey, thanks.
Thanks.
You have a great day.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Tina. Bye.
It's always good to hear people have appreciated who
Yeah.
you've gone to the trouble of finding to talk
bet.
to them.
And
Yeah.
we might next week. I've been doing some back and forth with the U.S. Patent Office.
Yes, he
We're
has.
hoping to have either someone on from the Patent Office in D.C. next week, or at least have the info that they're going to be supplying us.
Right. Because are there patents out there, and who holds them? And we want to know what would be the process, how close are some of them. I know they go into a position of being considered, and are some under review at this time. We want to know all of that.
We want to know it all.
Yeah.
So, Jim, you said we got 5 minutes, 6? All right. You know what? Why don't we go ahead and give him Vendetta Shiva just
Yes.
as a reminder. It's only 1 minute and 20 seconds.
Yes.
And it's so
Right.
apropos.
It is very, and we keep attempting to communicate with her as well.
Satyagraha means the fight for truth. Beginning 91, when these monopolies were created, we've had rally after rally, 500,000 farmers, 2 million farmers, basically declaring that seed is a common resource. We have received it from our ancestors. We have to protect it for future generations of all species. Because seed doesn't just belong to humans. It belongs to all the species who are nourished by any species of a plant. We will therefore not obey a law that makes it illegal for us to perform our highest ecological duty on earth, which is to save seeds for the future. So in 2004, we stopped this law from coming into force. I gave more, I don't know how many millions of signatures I gave to our Prime Minister, and said, you can do what the British did with the salt law. We are not going to obey because we have to obey higher law. Monsanto law is a low law, degraded law, and any law restricting farmers' rights is, in today's world, a Monsanto law. Even when governments write it, an invisible hand of Monsanto is behind that writing.
That's perfect. And
It was.
You know, I think we're going to send our thoughts and prayers out to James Blueiff and probably sign off here. And you got anything else, Ray?
No, just the standards. Stand up and speak out. If it's unjust, deal with it.
So you're at KPFZ 88.1 FM, Lake County Community Radio. This show's been Turning Point. And stay tuned for Wolf Tracks. Thanks for listening.
Here I am, stuck in the middle with you.